There often comes a time when speedrunners are inspired to try something new, whether it be for fun or they legitimately think that there's potential to be the best Pokemon for speedrunning. Scenarios like this always manage to come out of nowhere. And for Pokemon Platinum, this situation has caused a war for the top spot between two Pokemon, Piplup and Chimchar. How did this war come to be, and who is the actual fastest Pokemon for a Pokemon Platinum speedrun? For nearly an entire decade, Piplup was the king of Platinum, at least for the glitchless category. With how insane Empoleon becomes for the late game portions, all it ever needs is Surf. But the problem is that getting Piplup to become Empoleon is one of the hardest things to achieve in a Pokemon speedrun. It's no secret that the early portions of Platinum are ridiculously hard for Piplup. All because you have to face Mars, Pachirisu, Gardenia, Jupiter, Fantina, and your rival one after another, with a Pokemon that has a hard time consistently winning each of these battles. This made Pokemon Platinum glitchless speedruns a huge reset fest that barely let you play any of the game. And over the years, many speedrunners just avoided this speedrun altogether, all because of how unhealthy the cycle of using Piplup was for the early game. That is, until Pokemon speedrunners Crafted and Dexy figured out how to use Chimchar instead. The thing about Chimchar is that the potential was always there for the starter, but it was always theorized to be slower because of how Empoleon obliterates double battles and the entire late game with only Surf, saving an absolutely ridiculous amount of time. But what if that late game wasn't as important as folks thought? What if all it took to compete with Piplup was a really insane early game lead that it could barely keep up with? Eventually, Chimchar entered the fray. While it did have a massive weakness to Rorik's rock-type Pokemon, all it needed to do was evolve early to become the firefighting typing that Pokemon players despise, which got rid of its rock weakness and gave you a fast weapon to beat them up with. From here, every section that Piplup struggles on, Chimchar excels at. Mars, Pachirisu, Gardenia, Jupiter, and even the rival are much easier to handle for Chimchar. And once it becomes Infernape, nothing can stand in its way. It's a pretty similar story with Piplup as well for the late game, but because of the early game consistency that Chimchar brought to the table, many folks slowly shifted over to the Monkey. And after just enough tweaks to the route, the Monkey eventually overtook the Penguin for the fastest time. But as you may have guessed, Piplup runners didn't let that sit for long. After Chimchar eventually took over the world record spot, a new Piplup route was developed by Worcester that made the game faster, but at the cost of making the early game even harder. How, you might ask? Well, the original route would fight two hikers in order to obtain Bubble Beam for an evil Pachirisu in the forest, as well as an easier time on Gardenia. But by eliminating the hikers as well as skipping Flash Cannon, you could save an entire minute and 30 seconds over the course of the run. Luckily, this was done with an even better Piplup than the old route, but for a route that was already pretty unhealthy to speedrun mentally, making the early game even worse for the sake of speed was a hard pill to swallow when Monkey could finish runs left and right. But it eventually worked, and Penguin would rise again to claim the world record, starting a war that has lasted 3 years between both starters. And as of right now, the best Piplup time is a 3:37.38 by Scoagogo, while the best Chimchar time is a 3:36.54 by Crafted, leaving a 44-second gap between the starters, which is not a lot of time and probably makes you still question who is the best starter Pokemon. Well, now that I've explained the basic premise of each Pokemon, let's take a deep dive into the route side by side and figure out who is the best. For a glitchless speedrun of Pokemon Platinum, you need to use RNG manipulation to achieve the best times possible. And these manipulations are very similar to other Generation 4 Pokemon games. But unlike Heart Gold Soul Silver, we can't just grab a legendary Pokemon to dunk on the games with, making it so that the entire run is done with your starter Pokemon. Not even Giratina is worth capturing, since by the time that we reach Distortion World, our starter will be a much higher level and have way better moves. The very interesting thing about both routes is that each starter Pokemon will also have an extremely rare item that they need to rely on throughout the entire run. requiring them to go through certain means to get them via RNG manipulation. For Piplup, this item will be a metronome. The metronome item makes a move more powerful the more times you use that move in a row when it's equipped on your Pokemon, while Chimchar's item will be the Lucky Egg, an item that helps you gain more EXP. And what makes it even more interesting is that even though these items are powerful on each of the Pokemon that use them, getting a metronome for Chimchar is not worth it, and getting Lucky Egg for Piplup isn't either, because Chimchar handles the early game just fine, making the metronome item a lot less viable, while Piplup struggles early on and has a way easier time in the late game, making the Lucky Egg a lot less useful. When starting up a Pokemon Platinum glitchless speedrun, both routes have a pretty direct path to their starter Pokemon, with busted IVs and the best nature for each of those starters. All it requires is you to frame perfectly start up your game on a certain date and time, depending on what starter you're speedrunning with. From there, you beat up your rival, move on to the lab, and grab a few Pokeballs from the first shop. And this is where the starters start to split off from each other, because while both of them will need a Flyer and an HM Bidoof buddy, Piplup will need a Kricketot for its metronome item, because Kricketot has a 5% chance of holding a metronome, and the only way to snag that item at this point would be to catch it, which gives Chimchar the opportunity to pass Piplup, meaning it'll take some time for it to catch back up. As you start making your way into Jubilife City with Chimchar, you'll have to take a detour to the north side of the city, because the unfortunate thing is that Chimchar speedruns need a lot more EXP since you're required to evolve before Rorik. This would not be the case if Hidden Power was still available in the trainer school like it is in Diamond and Pearl, but since it isn't, we just kind of have to make do with what we have, making the most viable option to fight 4 extra trainers in order to evolve Chimchar into Monferno. While Piplup can just destroy Rorik with its water-type moves, and only needs to fight a Wild Onix and a single extra trainer for enough EXP for the route, giving them the lead temporarily as we pass Rorik. But it doesn't actually take too long for Chimchar to take the lead once again, especially since Mars gets obliterated by fighting moves, Pachirisu is barely a threat, and Gardenia and Jupiter can't handle the firefighting typing, while Piplup will have to rely on moves like Bubble, Pluck, and Bubble Beam to even stand a chance. Because unfortunately, we're gonna have to rely on Pluck to get through the grass-type Pokemon with our rough attack set on Prinplup, which forces us to suffer through a rough early game. And by the time Piplup is on the Jupiter fight, Chimchar is well on their way towards Hearthome City. And with good enough movement, you can take RNG manipulation from Twin Leaf Town onto Route 208 to force a Bibarel to show up, a Pokemon that can learn every HM under the sun. But more importantly, it can learn the move Thief. It's on Route 209 near the Lost Tower that a Chansey can be manipulated into holding a Lucky Egg. Then by using Thief, we can bypass the need to catch Chansey and just run away after stealing the egg. But with Chimchar being required to grab the Lucky Egg to save enough time to be worth using in a speedrun, Piplup gets yet another chance to surpass them. This is where things become more interesting, because it's always raining on the next route. But that's not fully a problem for Monferno, who doesn't really need his fire moves to plow through most of the route and can instead rely on their other moves for most of these fights. All while Piplup finally gets to rain down on their opponent by blowing beams of bubble in their face, taking every bit of advantage it can with the rain, all while knowing Monferno will never be able to use the sun in the same way, because permanent sun routes don't exist. But even with all these things giving Piplup a solid lead, things become relatively close from here on out, all thanks to receiving the final forms of both Pokemon right before Wake. And thanks to Gardenia, both Mons get access to Grass Knot, giving them an easy victory on Wake's gym. Then once Wake is completed, Chimchar won't get a chance to pass Piplup until after the Fog route, where Piplup can grab a free Choice Specs due to the time of day we get into the town. But that isn't the only weapon this town gives to Empoleon, because once we beat Cyrus, the only move we'll need for 90% of the fights will be Surf. Surf's 95 base power plus Choice Specs plus stab bonus plus a move that can hit multiple targets at a time plus Torrent gives you an unstoppable weapon that sweeps just about everything, even grass-type Pokemon that resist it. While Chimchar needs a little bit more coverage than Piplup, which includes moves that unfortunately have some really slow text, like close combat and flare blitz. But even with this disadvantage, Chimchar can keep up pretty well in what I would consider to be the most entertaining section of the game. This is where things start to become very close for the rest of the game. Empoleon slows down its Celestic with having to teach Surf and equip choice specs, letting Infernape go in and out of Cyrus fight before Empoleon can start it. But suddenly, the Infernape route requires a rare candy, as they go to the left side of Jubilife City, giving Empoleon just enough time to catch up since it doesn't need to stop and use that rare candy. Back and forth they go. Who's the fastest? Not many know, because Chimchar begins to barely catch back up, leaving Piplup slightly behind as they go into Canalave City and beat up Byron's gym. But now, it's time for Empoleon's biggest strength to show up, by being able to spam Surf on Team Galactic's double battles. While Chimchar unfortunately will have to take them down one at a time, but the lead surprisingly stays with Chimchar all the way until after Candace, all because Chimchar has a massive type advantage on this random Trophies trainer and Candace herself. But as per usual, the lead is only temporary, because inside of Galactic Base is a fight that you can choose to either be a single battle or a double battle. And as you may have guessed, Chimchar likes the singles, while Empoleon loves the doubles. This gives Empoleon one last chance to keep the lead for the rest of the game, since double battling is faster. But as of this video, the lead will stay with Chimchar for the rest of the game. While Chimchar does have to rely on moves with more text and less accuracy over the course of the rest of the game, the Lucky Egg starts to become the star of the show. With all the extra levels Chimchar gets with Lucky Egg, they'll end up reaching level 75 by the time they reach Cynthia, while Empoleon only gets up to level 66. I will say that this leveling animation does take some extra time, but so does setting up an extra amount since you're at a lower level. And that is where things start to become complicated when answering who is actually the fastest starter Pokemon. Since there are so many factors that slow down Chimchar, its use of close combat and Flare Blitz, having to fight 2 more trainers than Piplup, the extra 9 level up animations, the slightly slower send out animation of Chimchar and Monferno compared to Piplup and Primplup, and having to grab Lucky Egg in the first place. But more level ups also means less setup, which provides a massive net gain that helps keep Chimchar relevant compared to Piplup, especially with how much extra setup Piplup will need throughout the entirety of the game. But there is one more thing that I've yet to mention throughout the entire video, and that is the time loss between both Chimchar and Piplup world records. Chimchar's world record unfortunately had a nasty time inside of the rain route as well as Maylene, losing a total of 43 seconds, while Piplup lost about a minute to the section leading up to Gardenia, as well as a bit of extra time in the late game. But for the most part, everything else was pretty smooth for both starters throughout the entire game. 0 deaths, 0 optional trainers that aren't part of the route, and pretty banger RNG, which means that the current world records are very close to being a fairly perfect representation of how far these games can go when it comes to speedrunning. And at this point in time, we're at a part in Pokemon Platinum Glitchless history where both routes are likely at the point where every groundbreaking discovery has been found. So with all that said, who comes out on top to be the best? Well, according to Worcester and Piplup world record holder Scoagogo, it has been theorized many times that on the very tippy top end of the best possible times that could ever be achieved, Piplup barely comes out on top. With how little extra things it needs to do to complete the game, on top of the monster Empoleon and a total of 116 surfs used to beat the late portions of the game, all Piplup would need to do is hope and pray for a solid early game without deaths or optionals, and it would be able to reach a time of about 3:35, which is about a minute faster than the current world record involving Chimchar. But with how inconsistent and nasty that early game is for Piplup, it's hard to say when that day will ever come. Until then, we'll just have to sit idly by and enjoy the war between the consistent Chimchar and irritable Piplup speedruns.